in which children in nursery school and kindergarten drew pictures. And they drew pictures because they like to draw. The researchers took kids that like to draw and they started giving them a reward for drawing. The reward generally was a gold star or something that a young child would find rewarding. Then they stopped giving them the gold star. And what they found is the children had a much lower tendency to draw on their own. No reward. Now, remember, this was an activity that prior to receiving a reward, the children intrinsically enjoyed and selected to do. No one was telling them to draw. What this relates to is so-called intrinsic versus extrinsic reinforcement. When we receive rewards, even if we give ourselves rewards for something, we tend to associate less pleasure with the actual activity itself that evoked the reward. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but that's just the way that these dopaminergic circuits work.
What if you could have the energy and sustainable motivation for things that are to your advantage? Sometimes we might have a complete plan that can give us what we want. However, we lack the motivation and energy for its execution. If you feel the same, you are not alone. Human psychology and neurology play tricks. Interestingly, you can use that in your favor. You might want money, but don't want to work. What if you could harness the master manipulator that we call dopamine? Welcome back to another health and science-filled episode of NeuroDairy. In this video, we will uncover how you can harness the power of dopamine for satisfaction and achieve anything you want. Let's get started.
Being in pursuit and motivated and craving things feels wonderful. And I don't want to demonize dopamine. What I'm trying to do today is to illustrate how dopamine works in your brain so that you can continue to engage in dopamine-evoking activities. And certainly there is a place for ingesting things that can increase dopamine, provided that they are safe for us in the short and long term. There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? What are some of these activities? Well, in recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. In part, this was popularized by Wim Hof, the so-called Iceman, getting into cold showers, taking ice baths, exposing oneself to cold water of various kinds, can in fact increase our levels of dopamine as well as the neuromodulator norepinephrine. This is not a new phenomenon. In the 1920s, a guy by the name of Vincent Prisnitz was one of the first people to popularize and formalize cold water therapies. He was an advocate of cold water exposure in order to boost the immune system and increase feelings of well-being. And actually, this practice dates back long before Vincent popularized it. And Wim Hof is the more recent iteration of this. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very cold water, 30-degree Fahrenheit or even low 40-degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60-degree water or 50-degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40-degree water or 45-degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the quickening of the breath, the widening of the eyes, the feeling as if you can't catch your breath, and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. That's always the first experience of getting into cold water. There's no real way around that. Now, this study that I mentioned earlier, Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures. Really interesting study that was done and published in the the European Journal of Applied Physiology. I can provide a link to that study in the show caption. It's a really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. You can just put those online and do the conversion, or you can do the conversion to Fahrenheit if you like. But in any case, what they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reached levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. It was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. And I think this explains some of the positive mental and physical effects that people report subjectively after doing cold water exposure. One question that many of you are probably asking is, just how cold should the water be? Well, you could mimic what was done in this study and do 14 degrees Celsius, but for some people that won't be cold enough. For some people that will be too cold. They did look at the release of stress hormones like cortisol, in addition to the release of things like epinephrine and adrenaline. And it's interesting that they noted that in all cases, but especially at that coldest temperature, there was an increase in cortisol, but that it was transient, that eventually people's cortisol, the stress hormone, subsided a bit. There are basically two different approaches to remaining in the cold when it's uncomfortable. One is to try and relax yourself, to try and practice slow breathing, to try and dilate your gaze. I've talked about this before in previous podcasts, to go into panoramic vision, to essentially try and calm yourself so that it's not as stressful in the cold. Other people, however, take the approach of trying to ramp up their level of internal autonomic arousal, meaning to get really energized and kind of lean into the friction of the cold, and they find that easier. Other people distract themselves. They recite the alphabet, or they do anything to try and distract themselves from the discomfort. To be totally honest, it does not matter for sake of dopamine release, because the dopamine release is triggered and then continues even after you get out of the cold water. Now, in this study, it was long exposure to cold water. It was an hour. That's a long period of time. And I do warn you against getting into cold water that's so cold that it will make your temperature drop and make you hyperthermic for an hour. That actually could be dangerous for a lot of people. You might have a hard time reheating, and hypothermia is not a good thing. They had people monitoring subjects in these studies and paying attention to their core body temperature. They were able to reheat them afterwards. It's well established now that getting into cold water, whether or not it's a shower, an ice bath, circulating cold water, a stream, etc., that can evoke the norepinephrine release immediately and the long arc of that dopamine release. Why would that be good? Up until now, I've basically said getting increases in dopamine are detrimental to your baseline. Well, this does appear to raise the baseline of dopamine for substantial periods of time, and most people report feeling a heightened level of calm and focus after getting out of cold water. So cold water exposure turns out to be a very potent stimulus for shifting the entire milieu, the entire environment of our brain and body, and allowing many people to feel much better for a substantial period of time after getting out of the ice bath or cold water of any kind than they did before. Now, you might ask how often to do this. Some people do this every day. It can be very stimulating, so typically doing it early in the day it's going to be better. I don't necessarily recommend doing it right before sleep, but some people do it in the afternoon, and some people will indeed do that 7 days a week. Other people 3 days a week. Other people every once in a while. What I can say is once you become cold water adapted, once it no longer has the same impact of novelty and feeling a bit like a I don't want to say a shock to your system because you don't want to go into cold water shock, but once it is comfortable for you, then it will no longer evoke this release. There really does seem to be something in the pathway from cold water exposure through the norepinephrine pathway and into the mesolimbic brainstem that causes this release in dopamine. But nonetheless, it's a basically zero cost. I mean, you need access to water of some sort, cold water, shower, etc. But basically zero cost way of triggering a long-lasting increase in dopamine without ingesting anything, no pharmacology whatsoever. Please, again, approach it with safety and caution in mind, but it is a very potent stimulus. Again, 250% rise in baseline, 2.5 times rise in baseline rivals that of cocaine, which is really remarkable. Now I'd like to talk about the positive aspects of rewards for our behavior and the negative aspects of rewards for our behavior. And from that, I will suggest a protocol by which you can achieve a better relationship to your activities and to your dopamine system. In fact, it will help tune up your dopamine system for discipline, hard work, and motivation. Hard work is hard. Generally, most people don't like working hard. Some people do, but most people work hard in order to achieve some end goal. End goals are terrific and rewards are terrific, whether or not they are monetary, social, or any kind. However, because of the way that dopamine relates to our perception of time, working hard at something for sake of a reward that comes afterward can make the hard work much more challenging and make us much less likely to lean into hard work in the future. Let me give you a couple examples by way of data and experiments. There's a classic experiment done actually at Stanford many years ago in which children in nursery school and kindergarten drew pictures. And they drew pictures because they like to draw. The researchers took kids that like to draw and they started giving them a reward for drawing. The reward generally was a gold star or something that a young child would find rewarding. Then they stopped giving them the gold star, and what they found is the children had a much lower tendency to draw on their own. No reward. Now, remember, this was an activity that prior to receiving a reward, the children intrinsically enjoyed and selected to do. No one was telling them to draw. What this relates to is so-called intrinsic versus extrinsic reinforcement. When we receive rewards, even if we give ourselves rewards for something, we tend to associate less pleasure with the actual activity itself that evoked the reward. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but that's just the way that these dopaminergic circuits work. And now understanding these peaks and baselines in dopamine, which I won't review again, this should make sense. If you get a peak in dopamine from a reward, it's going to lower your baseline, and the cognitive interpretation is that you didn't really do the activity because you enjoyed the activity, you did it for the reward. Now, this doesn't mean all rewards of all kinds are bad, but it's also important to understand that dopamine controls our perception of time. When and how much dopamine we experience is the way that we carve up what we call our experience of time. When we engage in an activity, let's say school or hard work of any kind or exercise, because of the reward we are going to give ourselves or receive at the end, the trophy, the sundae, the meal, whatever it happens to be, we actually are extending the time bin over which we are analyzing or perceiving that experience. And because the reward comes at the end, we start to dissociate the neural circuits for dopamine and reward that would have normally been active during the activity. And because it all arrives at the end, over time, we have the experience of less and less pleasure from that particular activity while we're doing it. Now, this is the antithesis of growth mindset. My colleague at Stanford, Carol Dweck, as many of you know, has come up with this incredible theory and principle, and it actually goes beyond theory and principle, called growth mindset, which is this striving to be better, to be in this mindset of I'm not there yet, but striving itself is the end goal. And that, of course, delivers you to tremendous performance. It's been observed over and over and over again that people that have growth mindset, kids that have growth mindset, end up performing very well because they're focused on the effort itself. And all of us can cultivate growth mindset. The neural mechanism of cultivating growth mindset involves learning to access the rewards from effort and doing. And that's hard to do because you have to engage this prefrontal component of the mesolimbic circuit. You have to tell yourself, okay, this effort is great. This effort is pleasurable, even though you might actually be in a state of physical pain from the exercise. Or I can recall this from college, just feeling like I wanted to get up from my desk, but forcing myself to study, forcing myself. What you find over time is that you can start to associate a dopamine release. You can evoke dopamine release from the friction and the challenge that you happen to be in. You completely eliminate the ability to generate those circuits and the rewarding process of being able to reward friction while in effort if you are focused only on the goal that comes at the end, because of the way that dopamine marks time. So if you say, oh, I'm going to do this very hard thing and I'm going to push and push and push and push for that end goal that comes later, not only do you enjoy the process of what you're doing less, you actually make it more painful while you're engaging in it. You make yourself less efficient at it because if you were able to access dopamine while in effort, dopamine has all these incredible properties of increasing the amount of energy in our body and in our mind, our ability to focus by way of dopamine's conversion into epinephrine. But also, you are undermining your ability to lean back into that activity the next time. The next time you need twice as much coffee and 3 times as much loud music and 4 times as much energy drink and the social connection just to get out the door in order to do the run or to study.
Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist and professor at the Stanford University School of Medicine who knows how chemicals run our bodies. He says that if you get a continuous supply of dopamine in your body, then no matter what you do, you will do it using your full physical and cognitive capabilities. Well, that does not mean you should artificially induce dopamine production. However, you can benefit from it by keeping its limits. But how? Well, as Andrew Huberman said, caffeine, chocolate, exercise, nicotine, sex, pornography, and many more things can induce dopamine production. However, not all of them could be adopted and used long-term. If you do it, you will get addicted. However, there is a more sustainable method for dopamine induction as well. As Andrew Huberman said, cold exposure or cold baths are crucial in this matter. This phenomenon of increasing dopamine levels and feeling pleasure from cold exposure dates back to the 1920s, when a person named Vincent Priesnitz popularized cold therapies. The results of a study released in the European Journal of Applied Physiology show the same relationships between dopamine release and cold exposure. In this study, people were exposed to warm, hot, cold, and very cold water. And people in cold water experience a sudden increase in adrenaline, or the energy hormone. Not only that, but the dopamine level increased by 250% to the normal baseline level. It's just shocking that the dopamine increase when you take cocaine is lesser than the increase in case of cold exposure. Here's where we think about another point. Even if we can induce dopamine, let's say from cold baths, how to use them for our own purpose. Yes, we accept you have increased dopamine production, but chances are it won't work when you want to work hard, study, exercise, or do any task you hate to do. What to do in this situation? Well, Andrew Huberman says that even if you don't like doing something, force yourself to do it for some days. This resistance and forcing will ultimately create a dopamine release system of its own where dopamine production will start. In other words, the activity you hate to do will be more pleasing once you force yourself. Did you ever try to harness your dopamine level to get things done? Comment right below in the comment section. How would it be if humans could overpower neurology and hormones like dopamine? Would you like to watch more videos on neuroscience and health? If yes, subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to get the notification when we post the next episode. Thanks for watching, and until the next episode, stay tuned.